complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the show. How are you doing, man?
I'm well. Thank you. Hello, everybody.
I'm glad to have you back on. So this is the second in a series, you and I have planned to do on liberalism. And we discussed Hobbes last time you were on. And today we're here to discuss, I guess, what could be considered like the revolutionary paradigm, specifically, the French Revolution. So if you could you kind of, I guess, describe the kind of like cultural milieu that led up to the French Revolution, and then maybe explain why that's relevant to a discussion of liberalism.
Sure. I mean, I'm not an expert on the period, and I know way more about the German experience in modernity than I do that of France. But anybody who studies political philosophy or political theory in more than a cursory capacity, I mean, obviously they spend a lot of time with the Jacobin Revolution and things of that sort. I made the point before, and I mean, it's not just me, okay? It's like drawing on people who are far more learned than I to reach this conclusion. The true seed of liberalism, it's not, the Enlightenment, which is, a kind of, that term is a conceit of, people who have a very profound conceptual bias. Nor was it the Jacobin Revolution itself. It was the 30 Years' War, okay, in my opinion. And I'm sure there are some, and the rebuttal of that would be, well, you spend all your time, basically dealing with political philosophy and political theory, and that lends itself to a certain conceptual bias of juristic structures that kind of give form to statecraft, and and war and peace matters, and the management of these things, like within the parameters of the sovereign state, and and without, in the kind of anarchic landscape in which national states find themselves severally situated to this day, albeit in a very deteriorated form that I believe is changing. But that's what changed everything, and this is important. I don't want to hijack the conversation because it's your show and you're very generous to have me on, and plus I just want to be a dick, but I believe this is important. When I was talking to our guy Pete Canones the other day, about Christianity in the West, one of the things we covered, because you can't get away from it, is the fact that in the West there was a peculiar tension between clerical authority and political authority, because even at the zenith of the Roman Church and its ability to kind of decide, like who would be, who would be sovereign, in terms of the the noble houses and things. There was always this built-in tension, between functions, like the religious function and the political, and that's that's unique to the West. I mean, that's part of what Dumazel and people like that were getting at with the trifunctional hypothesis, and it's true. Okay, so there was never ever some European equivalent of the caliphate. Okay, like even at its absolute zenith of power, I mean, which you could people are far more learned in history of the Roman Church could assign the particular time period a lot better than I could, but like whatever epoch that may be, that still did not come close to something like the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Ottoman Caliphate at the peak of its power. I mean, not in terms of its ability to project power abroad or something, or outside of its own parameters, or the scope and scale of its authority. I mean, there was never ever a European cultural form where clerical authority and political authority were simply synonymous, and there was this. It was understood that there was just like a basic integration between the juristic, the theological, and the military, and and the sociological. Like that's not the case. So there was, but at the same time, the European state system, I mean, as we know it, even though, as I just said, you know, where you're watching it literally deteriorate. You know, it's not gonna fully you know fade into the proverbial ashes of history until you and I are both long dead. But that process is well underway. Is my point. Okay, but it but what we're not. But even the reason why the Westphalian system emerged and developed the way it did, and the reason why Europe had like what amounts to this kind of like warring states period that you know got more and more severe as modernity hit these kind of punctuated zeniths, in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, is because, like I said, in terms of the way power is divided internally, it's literally that, like a house divided. Okay, but what truly created like a legitimacy crisis of authority qua authority was the 30 Years War. Okay, however, that still was like a war between people who were serving God in the way that they understood, God to be relating to them. Okay, as individuals, as 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 members of a discrete ethnos, as Europeans, as subjects of a monarch, to whom they owed their loyalty and to whom they were beholden, for justice, and in some cases their very sustenance. But there's no aspect of the 30 Years War that was fighting under a banner of we've got to wipe away everything that came before. Everything about the preceding regime is corrupt. In order to advance history, or in order to create an equitable uh regime, we've got to burn down everything that came before. I mean, that nothing like that was afoot. That's exactly what was afoot in 1789. Okay, and I believe, Carlyle's History of the French Revolution, I think, is the seminal text on it. Others might disagree. I'm partial to Carlyle for a lot of reasons. That's kind of how that's kind of how I learned to study history, quite literally, is through Carlyle. But what the the uh, the annihilation of the European form of life was the Jacobin raison d'être, as it was the Bolshevik raison d'être. A century and a half later, approximately. Like, why did this happen? Well, when ruling structures, not just not just the person, um de jure or de facto, like, who sits on the throne, and not just the way government is organized in some formal way, but when everything about the structure in which man is posited in any given time and place just can no longer function. It can no longer deliver him, quite literally, his daily bread. There's no longer any kind of moral consensus, or even um rationally intelligible, like, paradigm upon which it derives its authority to coerce people to do things. When when that totally and completely deteriorates or implodes, um, what you're left with is an emergent nihilism, and what fills that vacuum um is axiomatically destructive. Like, why the French Revolution was so destructive. I mean, Michael Jones makes the point that the Marquis de Sade, I mean, he was a man who did time in the Bastille. De Sade very much, he made it very clear that he considered himself to be a political theorist. His idea wasn't just, I want to satisfy my base desires, and if I want to, if I want to brutalize prostitutes, or if I want to pursue homosexuality, or if I want to, victimize children, I should be able to do that. I mean, that obviously that was a big part of his worldview, but he was always clear that the reason you're doing this is because it's an insurrectionary act. And the way that you tear down the way that you tear down authority is to tear down public morals, and it makes people ungovernable. But also conceptually, it privileges passion over reason and will, so it opens the door to certain potentialities. Like, don't get me wrong, like Desaad himself was like a sexual deviant, and he was quite literally addicted to these things. I mean, that should be obvious. He was a profoundly evil person. But even were he not, or people who are not particularly fascinated by such things, they utilize such things in the same way, in order to tear down sociological structures that they view as obstacles to to power, or to implementing the vision that that they wish to impose upon the body politic and on life itself, within the parameters of the state in which they're aiming to subvert. That, like, how could a man like Desaad, like, or his ideas rather, how could they come to hold such fascination over large groups of people? Because the sexual instinct's a powerful thing. I mean, so is people who are brutalized and exploited, and people in that was underway. I mean, this wasn't just some kind of the reason why the Jacobins, like the Bolsheviks, developed the momentum they did is because the commoners did have legitimate grievances, and like a very kind of sanguinary bloodlust, develops in those circumstances. I'm not suggesting like these fools like Marcuse did, and like these Freudians did, who that man is like some kind of like that man's just like a physiological animal and who can speak by sort of some kind of evolutionary accident, and his psychic and emotional states are are like an object under pressure, and then when if a valve's not quite literally released, this explodes out and all kinds of destructive things, and the metaphorical shrapnel is antisocial behavior, of of an impassioned nature. I'm not saying anything like that, but the kind of nihilism that ensues from the conditions in which I described, which largely is out of man's hands, those epochal conditions that create zeitgeist, but such debased passions are emergent under such conditions, but so are other things. I think Napoleon, and I mean the Jacobin enterprise ended with Napoleon, okay, and that's not unlike the ascendancy of Cromwell and the conditions within which he, ascended to the position of Lord Protector, and it's not unlike Weimar. Okay, now I'm the first person to acknowledge that anyone who says history repeats itself is a fucking idiot, because it doesn't. However, the dialectical process is a real thing, and it occurs within certain parameters, conceptual parameters, because all human activity, is it shares features in common. Okay, and there's a commonality between human minds in any epoch. Okay, I mean, just in terms of not just like what's possible and what are like within its limitations, to perceive conceptually, but also the way in which dialectical processes kind of resolve within human minds, like severally and jointly. And so when I say that, like, there's a parallel between Weimar and the French Revolution and the War of Three Kingdoms and Cromwell's subsequent ascendancy, I'm not saying history is repeating itself. Like, I'm saying that there's certain features in common to revolutionary conditions. There's a dialectical process that both gives rise to those conditions and subsequently resolves them. And, the types of figures that emerge within those processes, to wield messianic power, or if you want to allow that, these individuals who seem to embody the zeitgeist to the point that political events truly revolve around them, the personage of them, as well as, you know, the office or role in which they're situated. You know, that has formal characteristics in common. That's what I meant. That's probably pretty long-winded and may not have answered the question, but that's the short answer for why, or I guess not particularly short answer for why the French Revolution is key. And like I said, I can't. I mean, what was the preceding event or series of events? You know, wherein European people tore down the existing order completely and literally put all identified categorically the people he considered to be the standard bearers of that preceding order, categorically exterminated them, and deliberately, owing to the nihilism resulting from the collapse of the old order, said we're going to deliberately and purposely tear down everything that was the progeny, of the epistemic priors, in apocal terms. I can't think of anything like that happening. Okay, I mean, yes, there was like terrible civil wars in Europe. I mean, there was catastrophes, like you know, like Mongol ingress into the continent, and the fights against the Umayyad Caliphate and things like that. But there's not there was not some precedent for what happened in 1789. And I don't want to just get into gory details for their own sake, but there were categorical exterminations within the Reign of Terror. Okay, and Norman Davies made a lot of that in a kind of low key way, which I credit. I think there's a lot of credit for, because the favored means was to load hundreds of prisoners onto ships, take them so far from the shore, accompanied by with an accompanying vessel, and then deliberately sink the ship with everybody on it. I mean, this is what they did, in lieu of, obviously, putting a round in the back of people's heads and kicking them into a ditch, because I mean, there's nothing funny about that, but my point being that, there's parallels there too, and I only raised that. I mean, not to be macabre, but it's relevant to, the degree to which the kind of binding moral consensus had completely disappeared, but also this idea that, oh well, the categorical extermination of people based on subjective characteristics, non-combatants. I mean, oh, this never happened before, Bobby Yar or something. It did happen. It happened in Europe, and I mean, obviously the Soviet Union. They did this for decades before shot was fired in World War II, but but I mean, it preceded that even by a century and a half. And I'll give it over to you, man, because I'm talking too much.
No, it was interesting what you said, and to go back to what you were mentioning about Marquis de Sade, reading de Maistre to prepare for this, and I guess I hadn't considered this, but there was this kind of just astounded air where these people couldn't believe, at least the people de Maistre was responding to, that the revolution could have been, kind of like brought on by, unimpressive people, in these kind of like wastrels and sexual degenerates and all that. And it's interesting because de Maistre has this line where he says, like, men did not use the revolution used men.
Definitely.
And it's almost this idea that this revolution was this kind of like this powerful force which kind of drove everyone before it. And de Maistre has an interesting, it's almost accelerationist kind of tact to it, where he views the revolution as, punishing its own practitioners. He says,
yeah,
because he's a legal scholar, and so he basically says, like, well, if there's ever going to be a restoration, a good king could never kill everyone involved in that. That would be just monstrous. It would be inefficient. But essentially, Providence with a capital P is causing them to destroy themselves, in more monstrous ways than a king could ever derive.
It was both a crime and a punishment.
Exactly. Yes. And one of the other things that I think is is important to see in this is that France was at the time the jewel of Europe. It was kind of like the height of civilization. The other major, European civilizations they were just less unified. It was before, kind of like the nationalist projects of the 19th century.
Oh
And
yeah,
so
it's
it very
France and
much
the
was
UK. Yeah.
right. And to see this kind of like, this high watermark of, European civilization, this high watermark of monarchy, completely demolished and brought to its knees essentially by this kind of like almost like outside providential force must have just been, and I understand why, the people he's writing to sound shell shocked. It's almost incomprehensible.
Well, it's also people don't understand when they think of. I mean, even people in this country don't really, and they haven't. I mean, it's not within living memory, and nothing like it was. Nothing like it was in the American experience, other than the war between the states. But people these days can't. They can't conceive of a situation where your neighbors and quite literally join up with some mob that may decide to categorically exterminate you. And I mean that's really what was underway. I'm not overstating the kind of the megacidal character of the Jacobin Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, to kind of score like ideological points. I mean, why would that matter anyway? But because the sovereign losing its absolute monopoly on violence in a total capacity, that's remarkable. And that's also the key to understanding how revolutions are possible, in ontological and psychological terms. But it's also, again, people act like the 20th century was this, like the revolutionary imperative was this weird anomaly and that it emerged from the right. And that's totally, that's wrong in every conceivable way, you know? And the degree to which, the degree to which the Jacobin Revolution truly shocked the conscience even of hardened people, um, was the only thing comparable to it before or subsequent was the Bolshevik Revolution, and the degree of, the destruction of human life in categorical terms is truly awesome. Not awesome like it's cool and we like it, like awesome in that it defies the imagination almost, and that well, it also goes to show you too that it goes to show you too that um you know when the moral order does truly deteriorate, that's nothing to do with like the state bureaucracy and officialdom. Like government is the last thing anybody needs really in just about every circumstance. But the issue with the French Revolution wasn't that government officialdom like wasn't working well anymore. Like the issue was that all became permissible. Like what was it, Dostoevsky? I'm really badly read in like a lot of literature. I mean, I've read Mark Twain and I like Walker Percy and stuff like that, but I'm probably kind of like an uncultured fuck in other ways. But I believe it's in Dostoevsky, like the Brothers Karamazov. He wrote that, right?
Yes, he
Did
did.
Dostoevsky write Karamazov? Yeah, like one of the uh like the kind of wastrel prodigal says to either says to his father or he says to his brother, like, like nobody truly believes all is lawful because that nobody could live under those conditions just in practical terms. Well, something like the day the Bastille was stormed, or you know the the kind of zenith of the Bolshevik murder machine. Um, you know, in in the 1920s, probably like 1920, 21. Well, I mean that's exactly what happened. Like all did become lawful, and that's probably as close as one could come to hell as an existential reality. Like I'm not trying to start a theological debate about like is there a metaphysical hell and do we go there. What I'm saying is that if you conceive of hell, as kind of the total alienation from reason, and any kind of moral restraint, that's what it would look like. And I'm of the belief, the stupid kind of the whole Purge series is stupid, and it's just like bougie idiots like being scared of everything and everybody. But the premise abstracted from like the dumb narrative, people do weird things when all does become lawful. And I mean, a lot of these people are more weak than they are just bad. And I mean that's something that can't really be overstated. And you see it at reduced scale at stuff like Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Like people go pretty crazy pretty fast. And there's not a hell of a lot keeping a lot of people under control. And this idea that like, well, man always kind of finds his way to reason, even in the absence of social reinforcement and reliable survivable structures. That's really not true. That's not to say that like most guys walking around are, would do a bank job and just like rape pretty girls. The minute it became clear that the police weren't going to enforce the law anymore. But things would go south a lot quicker than people think. But there's also like a despairing aspect too. I mean, that's the the spiritual degradation of the person. When people are when those conditions are emergent and human beings are situated in them and they can't get away. And in those days, you literally couldn't get away. Okay, I mean, where are you going to go? But that it creates this kind of bottomless despair. So it's like if I'm reduced to like living like an animal, and these people who I thought were my neighbors and friends, who at least in some way like loved me because we were part of this common, community of not just of race and blood and flesh, but of spirit. Like I see these guys looting everything and like raping my little sister or whatever. Like how can I find like God in everyday life anymore? And like how can I like believe that anything's worthwhile anymore? I'll probably just become a barbarian myself, if nothing else, because it's the only way I can survive psychically until this runs its course. I'd like to think that wouldn't happen to me, but it probably would. Okay. And that's important to consider too. People are just people. They're not. It's not like. I mean, yeah, okay, like people like you and myself, and like the people who are tuning in to what we're talking about. I'm not. They're not like some like fucking ignorant hood rat with an IQ of 70 who'll empty a magazine into somebody for a pair of shoes. But we're also not like gods among men who just can like overcome that kind of existential despair and like not give in to debased impulses, in some kind of total like war of all against all situation. I believe that's important to consider.
No, I think there's something to that, and it is. I don't know. It was interesting in the sense that revolution wasn't just confined to kind of like the political myth of revolution, right? Which is a new political, a new political order. And you see this in kind of a lot of the like globo homo propaganda. So like if you've ever seen a movie or played a game where there's a revolution, it's like Star Wars. You blow up the Death Star, you kill the space Nazis, and then everyone lives in John Lennon's Imagine. Right. But when we see this kind of like blueprint for all revolutions, because really like it was on a certain level unprecedented event, because there had been revolts before, right? There had been slave revolts, there had been peasants revolts. But this was a from the ground up revolution, right? Nothing was left, unturned. Obviously, sexual mores, kind of like the way power was organized. And what's especially interesting is that it had this kind of like dualistic, two-faced nature of on one hand being completely unreasonable, abandoning it all to the passions. And on the other, kind of like worshiping reason as its God, quite literally, right? With the temple of reason. And you see this as well with kind of like the move to a new calendar and things like it, where it is.
Oh yeah, and like
I don't know. It is
and creating like literally the cult of the quote supreme being, who is some sort of like collective intelligence abstracted from like man, but like at the same time like constituted of all men. Like yeah, it was proto Bolshevism in every sense, and yeah, these people were the equivalent of these bizarre freaks today who were like, we're doing science, like it's a reason, like you can have sex whenever you want, and there's no there should be no restraint on individual expression, so long as it so long as it doesn't interfere with revolutionary processes, because this is grounded in reason. When in reality it's the opposite. But that's the only something to keep in mind. I mean, the Jacobin Revolution too, like the Bolshevik Revolution, like it had no intention ever of containing itself to the frontiers wherein it was emergent. I mean, they wanted to march on Europe, okay, and they tried to. And the one of the reasons why, I mean, it's not just because it's not just because all revolutions are at base, theological in conceptual terms, but something like Jacobinism, like communism, and like America, the American ideology, which is basically like an amalgamation of a kind of post-Jacobin, post-Marxism, and Zionism. These things they can't abide any competing structure, because I mean, for practical reasons, but also it's got to annihilate everything that came before. It cannot allow the preceding order in conceptual terms, the preceding conceptual horizon, to continue to exist. And the only way you can eradicate that is by eradicating it from ever existing. That means you've got to exterminate the standard bearers of that idea, and like literally the vessels wherein which that idea is contained, which is human beings and their minds. But you've also got to eradicate any trace of it in terms of institutional legacy, even if only in structural terms. This is the case of in from everything that appears relatively benign, like tearing down a Stonewall Jackson statue, to the Red Khmer's claim that, well, this is year zero, so we're gonna create a new alphabet. If you use the old alphabet, sorry, we're gonna put a round in your head, because there's nothing personal, but we can't have the old kind of people anymore. We can't let them live, because you're gonna corrupt the blank slate. I'm not like equating one thing with the other, but I'm saying that they drink of the same like ideological wellspring, however diluted the one is, and however like pure and poisonous the other is. There's not other ideological tendencies like that. Like even if you were a hardline phalangist in 1930, you didn't have this idea that, well, once we win in Spain or Italy or Portugal or whatever, we've got to march everywhere else, and we've just got to annihilate everybody who doesn't like take a knee before our sovereign symbols or something. I mean, yeah, you can look at Barbarossa as a crusade against Bolshevism, but Bolshevism itself its raison d'etre was the extermination of the European way of life, in physical as well as conceptual terms. It wasn't just, we've got to annihilate this because it just can't exist, and that's important. I'm sure there's going to be people who savage me in the comments section or whatever and say that that's not true, but it is true. Okay. And it's not even a question of me saying like Jacobins are so evil. I mean, they are evil, or the Bolsheviks were literally anti-God, and they were, but that's not the reason I raised it. And it's not to bandy some kind of moral judgment about like how horrible these people were or something. It's that's the unique that's the unique feature. That's the truly unique feature of the revolutionary impulse in modernity. Okay, is that it can't abide anything outside itself. And as politics became total, not just in terms of war and peace questions and the ability to project power and things like that, but just conceptually, the political came to touch and concern like everything man did, and every man's life, whether be him a prince or a pauper or anything in between, that changes everything, and the kind of savage birth cry of that tendency, was 1,000 people like being drowned alive on one of these death ships by the Jacobins. We can't get away from that. That's a real thing.
So it's interesting because when reading, de Maistre, several things jumped out to me. In addition to just his description of the French Revolution, which is one that he has a profoundly anti-liberal way of viewing things. So there are two ideas he has that are linked, I think, obviously, and you'll see how they relate to the revolution, which is one, that war and violence is the normal state of human affairs. And if anything, peace is the aberration. And on the other, he says that the way that societies clean themselves and kind of purge themselves of social infection is through war and bloodshed. So what do you think about that, and how do you think that relates to this event?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, there's a socially hygienic aspect to it also, but there's a negatively theological aspect too within within de Maistre's conceptual model. You know, the Earth is a giant ultra sacrifice. Okay, and the legacy of the fall, or I mean, if you're a Hegelian, I guess, trying to put the Maistre in terms that are more intelligible to one's own conceptual preferences or prejudices. Um, the dialectical process of history, like mind is like the move on of the dialectical process, and dialectical process as, the engine of history, quite literally. Um, that's basically like an endless series of massacres and sacrifices until literally like the death of death, which, you know, either occurs on Judgment Day or occurs, at the point of ultimate and final transcendence, you know, um, in secular terms, which in I believe the later 20th century, people developed very strange ideas relating to this in nuclear war. That's outside the scope, but I mean I made the point. Another thing I raised with Canones is like it comes to bear on when people say that, de Maistre was this man who was in love with suffering or something. He wasn't at all, and in fact, he was very much like an Orthodox Christian in his ontology, not Orthodox like Eastern Orthodoxy. I mean Orthodox in terms of conventional and to the letter of Scripture and things. I mean, like man does not live in heaven as a god. Like the earth has more in common with hell than it does with heaven, and that's the legacy of the fall. Okay, um, it's totally misguided when people are like, well, if not you, obviously. I mean, when people, whether talking about the Maestro or talking about anybody else who's, basically one of the counter enlightenment thinkers, like, oh, if providence is active in history, like, why do children die and why do wars happen? It's like that's God. The hand of God is why these things happen. It's like where did you read in Scripture that the earth is a heaven, a telluric heaven, and man is without sin, and there will be no suffering and no suffering of little children, and there'll be no death. Like what? This is crazy. So yeah, it's an essential process, and I mean bloodletting is that's why the distilled essence of sovereignty, as Schmidt borrowed from de Maistre and from some others, is the ability to decide who lives and who dies. And the truly mysterious and unknowable kind of monumental instantation of state power is the executioner. He looms far larger than the king. Okay. Um, and the way to look at the executioner isn't as some policeman. Like the way to look at him as some kind of like a high priest of death. And those who fall under his blade are that's a sacrificial blood that reinvigorates the state. Um, and so long as everybody continues to bow before it and not attempt to tear it down and replace the executioner and stand in his stead, the state will endure. To a varying degree of greater or lesser power in practical terms. So yeah, the Maestro probably influenced me more than any other more than any other political theorist in terms of like his account of the state. And existentially and like And I in terms of his description of like man's experience of state power, like I think Hobbes is kind of obviously been more impactful on the Western intellectual tradition, but the Maestro's description of political theology is second to none, and it happens to be true. And the aesthetics of it, and the way the Maestro suggests where to understand it, if you're a man of the right, like that's where you should fall, kind of. The Maestro was a highly unusual Catholic, as you know, because you're reading him, and which doesn't surprise me. There's a lot of very brilliant guys who are, on the one hand, like very orthodox in their kind of faith and their view of God and God's dominion over man and man's affairs, but also have kind of like a heterodox view of like heterodox in the sense that it doesn't really comport with the traditional the traditional view through the lens of Aquinas, say, of government.
So, to what degree can it be said that the French Revolution was, I guess, I'm trying to find words to discuss this. To what sense is the French Revolution the product of or the genesis of liberalism?
Liberalism is not just an animating principle, but a truly revolutionary force, or an aspect of a revolutionary force that is so kind of monumental in its in its significance and its ability to impact man's affairs, prosaic and profound, that literally everything else in political terms, conceptually and practically, is in dialogue with it. The Jacobin Revolution made that possible. Okay, the true origin of liberalism, like I said, to me, is the 30 Years' War. All right, I mean, in the 16th century, there were proto-liberal thinkers, okay, and there were people who contributed to that tendency, and the kind of key figures in liberalism, whether you're talking about whether they're talking about like Bentham or Paine, who are viewed as very much kind of like pragmatic and respectable, or whether you're talking about totally deviant and radical types like the Sade. All of those tendencies were made possible by the 30 Years' War, and even Hobbes himself. I mean, Hobbes was an absolutist. Hobbes had a lot of contempt for like subsequent liberal conceits, but he's got to be included in that dialectical paradigm. And this is why I'm always saying it's like the relationship of Hobbes to the right is fascinating to me. I think of it it's kind of like Hegel's relationship to the left, but I'm not saying like Hobbes is some like left wing thinker. That's ridiculous. Like he was not, but the progressive rationalist tradition in political philosophy did in fact begin with Hobbes in some basic sense, but go ahead.
No, I was just going to make another point from De Maistre, and this is a very reactionary point, which I guess makes sense given its source. But he describes human affairs as being limited. He describes them as the sides of a die. The idea that there is only a certain number of kind of permutations of how humans can organize things. Definitely. And so certainly there are rarer or more common occurrences on the die. But the idea that you can come up with an entirely new system of human governance, at least from his perspective, and I would argue from ours as well, is just it's unrealistic. It's not how I guess humans work.
Well, and one of the Maestro's major, I mean, it seems like an obvious point, but I think it needs to be stated, and he stated very eloquently, like we've talked about before, just in more kind of general, as a general postulate, like the origin of political authority is mysterious. Like where did the concept of monarchy come from? Where did where did the idea of different social functions come from? Like a priestly caste, like a class of nobles, like a warrior caste, like the kind of liberal ontology that suggests like man was just kind of like this rational integer who was like, oh, I'm going to join this community of people and we're going to do this, and then we're going to we're going to create this kind of like social architecture. Like, I mean, I'm being liberally obtuse, but when you read somebody like Rawls, they actually write like that's what happened. So yeah, not only is there a limited number of ways in which political structures can be configured, but their origin itself like seems to be outside of man's willful decision making. Even if you try and take God out of the equation or providence or whatever, it's this idea that I can just kind of build a political order from scratch. Like even if that was practicable, in kind of the most basic terms, like you can't just like insinuate like authority into people's minds by declaring like, well, this is the new government because I say so, or because our council of ministers, they're like the most rational men we have and they're enlightened and they say this is the way to do things. I mean, yeah, there's obviously like a social learning aspect, classical conditioning aspect. There's a primitive fear aspect to why people will abide sovereign authority, but those things mean nothing unless conceptually it holds place in their minds individually and collectively as as a truly sovereign agent, and quite literally a godlike agent on earth. And those kinds of things can't be confabulated. The world's not the Wizard of Oz. I can't just build a castle and build a scary system of social architecture and a secret police force and say I'm a god among men. I mean, yeah, I can lock a lot of people up and kill a lot of people and scare a lot of people, but like when I die, I'm gonna be like Ceausescu. Like nobody's gonna say that like I was the god emperor who was ordained by providence to rule. So it's like, okay, well, why is that? It's not because like man suddenly became wise to these things in 1989 or something. It's because these things can't just be, these things can't just be like cobbled together out of nothing. So yeah, that's fundamentally important.
So given that, why do you think that the given that there is this kind of mysterious source of authority, this kind of mandate of heaven, why do you think that the French crown was able to be unseated, almost seemingly out of nowhere? And I realized that there was a difference between, and reading, kind of like sources at the time, that everyone makes a distinction between the Parisian crowd, right, the mob of Paris, and then what was going on in the rest of France. But nonetheless, that is interesting that essentially it seems like the mandate was withdrawn very quickly from an ancient.
Okay, I think
government.
things, I think things changed as it truly, and this is not me burning the capitalist class in effigy or something, but Hannah Arendt, when in talking about her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, you can't just dismiss her as being this kind of like strange Jewish lady who had some heterodox ideas. There's a reason why she and Heidegger were so tight. She certainly wasn't right wing or anything, but she had certain insights into political sociology, particularly of the Jewish people. And when not just money but qua commerce became insinuated into political life, that caused a lot of chaos. And you did have this kind of nascent, and it wasn't just because they were it wasn't just because they were urban and urbane. There'd always been that. This kind of distinct ontology developed like around the way these people lived their lives and what they aspired to, and how they felt about you know, what theretofore had been perennial authority. And in the case of the population that Ren was talking about, you add to that the fact that they're Jewish and there's this whole kind of, you know, literally revolutionary spirit animating them. I mean, that caused all kinds of other tensions. But some things really did change in modernity. That's overstated. But as is this kind of like moronic midwit descriptions of the quote rise of the middle class and this idea of like the middle class itself. But the political system became exponentially more complicated, not just by money and commerce, but by the things that facilitated money and commerce, and that made what proceeded unworkable. Now, if you had a national state or something approaching a national state that had a truly deep moral consensus and a truly deep empathy between people, I mean, owing to, you know, racial solidarity or, you know, confessional sect in common or, you know, all kinds of other things, this could be mitigated. And I mean, we're getting ahead by a century and a half, but this is what National Socialism aimed to do, and it did that very effectively. If you don't have those things, or if you live in a divided society, you know, just that, you know, owing to its structural features, you're probably going to have a very serious legitimacy crisis. The worst case scenario is the kind of subversion of 1789 and the subsequent bloodletting. But even absent conditions that severe, it's probably going to be very, very problematic in terms of achieving some kind of new consensus without pretty severe suffering and human cost.
So, Thomas, I'm sort of running out of time. Is there anything you want to say as we kind of bring this to a close?
No, man. Like I said, I'm not an expert on the French Revolution, but I hope it was worthwhile. I hope I didn't bore people to death or you know, come off as lacking in the topic you want to discuss. I'm always very honored, man, when you invite me to record. Like, legit, it's great, and I really like your subscribers in the Beaver Mafia, or, you know, whatever you guys are riding under these days.
Well, anyway, man, if people want to find more of your stuff, where can they find you? Because I know you've launched a new YouTube channel, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I uploaded my Dresden live stream on there just as kind of a test. I'm restructuring and reskinning my brand, like, really from the ground up. I'm not like quite literally. I'm not just like talking trash or like hyping myself. I think we're gonna get banned from YouTube pretty quickly, but I am gonna upload I'm launching like a whole new like program. Okay, it's gonna be basically like a video podcast. And in a few days, I'm gonna drop the preview of that. But you're going to be able to find us on YouTube at Thomas TV, number 7, HOMAS TV. But our main home is going to be Substack. Like, all the video episodes are going to appear on Substack. I'm also going to back up on Odyssey and other stuff. And just like odds and ends, I'm going to upload onto YouTube. But again, like, when it does launch, you know, in the next several days, you know, like, go to Substack to find it if it just disappears. Because I'm telling you, like, YouTube's not going to let us indefinitely do our thing. But you can always find me on Substack. Speaking of which, it's real Thomas777.substack.com. I'm on Twitter for the time being, but this is like my 9th account. So I mean, they're going to nuke that too. But for now, it's a place where we can at least make contact in basic terms. It's at real _Thomas number 7 HOMAS 777. I've got a Telegram channel too. I mean, they fucking deplatform me, if you can believe that. But you can find the link to that on Substack and on YouTube. And that's all I got for now.
Well, great, man. And those will be linked down in the description. As far as my stuff, you know, I should say that this is, you know, one of the first Jay Burden shows to be sponsored. We're sponsored by Axios Remote Coaching, which basically, if you want to stop being, you know, a fat, pathetic piece of shit, JD at Axios is the guy to head over to. I've been working with him, and he's been really helpful. He knows his stuff. He's been on the show a couple times, and he's one of us. So head over there if you want to support the show. And again, he's a good dude, and I was friends with him before he sponsored me. So you guys should support him. And as far as my content, it's pretty easy. It's the same stuff it's always been, which is this is available on YouTube, obviously, but also Apple, Spotify, Odyssey, anywhere you listen to shows. If you do want to support the show directly, which I really do appreciate, you can do that at all the normal ways, Patreon, subscribe to our Substack. And the benefit you get for doing that is that you get access to episodes early. So episodes like this one, for instance, there's a little bit of a downtime between when I record them and when they hit the main feed. And if you want to pay me a few bucks to cover the cost of the show, well, you'll get to hear them when I record them. And anyway, guys, thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. And remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.